Hi, everybody. I hope you're all well and waiting for the next royal mystery. Well, ready or not, here it comes. We have spoken previously about what would happen if, God forbid, anything should happen to Charles and William before George turns 18. The most likely scenario would always have been that Harry would act as regent until George was old enough. Can you imagine what a disaster that will be? Well, in 1483, something similar did happen. On the 9th of April, 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. At the time of his death, his son Edward V was at Ludlow Castle. At the time, Edward V was only 12 years old, and his brother Richard, Duke of York, was only 9. Shortly before his death, Edward IV designated his own brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, or then the Regent. Like is the custom, Edward V became king the moment his father died, but of course he needed adult guidance. So on the 29th of April, King Edward V and his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, met at Stony Stratford. However, the next morning, the Duke of Gloucester arrested Edward V's whole entourage, including Edward and Richard's uncle, Anthony Woodville, their mother's brother. They also arrested their half-brother, Sir Richard Grey. They were sent to Pontefract Castle, where they were beheaded on the 25th of June. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took possession of the young Prince Edward himself. Elizabeth Woodville took her other son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. The Duke of Gloucester took Edward to London, supposedly for his coronation, but the coronation was postponed from the 4th of May to the 25th of June. Edward was even taken to lodge in the Tower of London, as it was traditional for the monarch to stay over there prior to the coronation. On June the 16th, Edward was even joined by his brother Richard, but soon after, the coronation date was quickly postponed indefinitely. And on the 22nd of June, a Dr. Ralph Shaw preached at St. Paul's Cross and claimed that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was the only legitimate heir of the House of York. On June 25th, a group of lords, knights, and gentlemen petitioned for Richard to take the throne, and both young princes were declared illegitimate on the basis that Edward and Elizabeth's marriage was invalid, because Edward had a pre-contract of marriage with Lady Eleanor Butler. The fact that he did not actually go on to marry her, but married Elizabeth instead, seemed not to matter, and the Duke of Gloucester was crowned King Richard III on the 6th of July. But what happened to the young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York? To be honest, no one really knows. Most historians believe the princes were murdered, likely towards the end of summer 1483. There are reports of the two princes being seen playing together shortly after Richard arrived, but there are no further recorded sightings of either of them after the summer of 1483. There was a slight rebellion against Richard in July 1483, and an attempt was made to rescue the boys, but it failed. There are a small group of people who believe that they were still alive as late as July 1484. However, to date, nothing has been proven beyond any shadow of a doubt. And other than the fact that these two boys disappeared, there is, to this day, no evidence that they were murdered. And I will shortly tell you why. Rumors spread very fast, even as far as France. In January 1484, The Lord Chancellor of France issued a warning naming King Richard as the one who killed the princes. However, another investigation named the Duke of Buckingham as the person who put the two princes to death. Richard Fabian's Chronicles of London also named Richard III the murderer. Thomas More, who wrote The History of King Richard III, identified Sir James Tyrrell as the murderer, acting on Richard III's instructions. According to More, Tyrrell confessed and said the boys were smothered in their beds. Polydore Virgil, in his Anglica Historia, also specifies that Tyrrell was the murderer and that he did the deed with reluctance upon Richard's orders. In July 1674, workmen remodeling the Tower of London dug up a wooden box containing two small human skeletons. The bones were found 10 feet or then 3 meters under the staircase leading to the chapel. However, and unfortunately in a way, these were not the only children's remains to be found within the tower. The bones of two other children had previously been found in an old chamber that had been walled up. Anyway, as the bones in the box were found with pieces of rag and velvet around them, it was assumed that the velvet indicated that the bodies were those of aristocrats, and the bones were placed in an urn and interred at Westminster Abbey with an inscription which states, "Here lie interred the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York," etc., etc. In 1933, the bones were removed and examined by Lawrence Tanner, the archivist at Westminster Abbey, and anatomist Professor William Wright and George Norcroft, president of the Dental Association. They concluded that the bones belonged to two children, more or less the correct ages for the two princes. But many of the bones were missing, and others were indeed broken by the workmen, and therefore the examinations was heavily criticized, stating that no attempt was even made to determine whether the bones were male or female. And now for the crux of the matter and what appears to be a recurring theme. No further scientific examination has since been conducted, as a petition started in an effort to request that the bones be DNA tested was closed before its closing date. Pollard's excuse was that even if modern DNA and carbon dating proved that the bones belonged to the princes, it would not prove who killed them. But that is not all. Hang on, it becomes even more mysterious and strange. In 1798, workmen carrying out repairs in St. George's Chapel accidentally broke into the vault of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, discovering a small adjoining vault. In the vault were the coffins of two unidentified children. No examination was made, and the vault was resealed, and inscribed were the names of their other children, George, who died aged 2, and Mary, who died at 14. However, in 1810, while doing excavation for the royal tomb for King George III, two lead coffins, clearly marked and labelled as that of George and Mary, were found elsewhere in the chapel. The coffins were moved into Edward IV's vault without any effort being made to find out who the children in the other coffins were. In 2012, a request was made to examine the contents of the 4 children's coffins in Edward's vault, as well as the bones of the 2 princes, and I'm saying 2 princes in inverted commas because obviously that is how it was labelled in Westminster Abbey, but Queen Elizabeth II never granted the approval required. It is also notable that there had been two individuals who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. The second one, Perkin Warbeck, was recognized by Margaret of York, the sister of Richard III, as being Richard, the Duke of York. James IV of Scotland also recognized him as Richard. In 2021, researchers from the Missing Princes Project claimed to have found evidence that Edward V had lived out his days in a rural Devon village called Coldridge. They linked the 13-year-old prince to a man called John Evans, who arrived in the village in around 1484 and who was immediately given an official position and the title of Lord of the Manor. So, what do you think? What happened to the young Prince Edward and his brother Richard? Why had the royal family blocked further investigation? What impact will it have if it is eventually discovered that neither Richard nor Edward died in the tower? Well, I would like to hear your opinion. So, until we meet again on the next one, please take good care of yourselves. Bye.